At the height of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from the burning sands of Arabia to the damp forests of northern Britain. No other power in the ancient world matched its reach. Its legions erased rival kingdoms, remade cities, and forced landscapes to bend under the weight of ambition. Roads pierced mountains. Aqueducts carried rivers across valleys. Rome projected an image of inevitability. Whatever it willed, it achieved. And yet, there was one frontier where that inevitability faltered. North of the river Forth, under perpetual mist and rain, Rome halted. In the year 122, the Emperor Hadrian commanded a wall of stone to be raised, not as a bridgehead for conquest, but as a line of refusal. It was the empire's confession carved into stone. Beyond this line lay a land Rome would not master. Why? How could the same legions that crushed Gaul, razed Jerusalem, and subdued Germania fail to subdue a sparsely populated region of hills and bogs? That is the puzzle. And in solving it, we confront not only the limits of military power, but the truth that even empires are bound by geography, economics, and human resistance. Stay with me until the end, because the answer is more complex than defeat. It is about the nature of empire itself. If you value history told with evidence and clarity, subscribe to Tale of History, and tell us in the comments, could Rome have succeeded in Caledonia if it had fought differently? For centuries, Rome had seemed unstoppable. Gaul fell after Julius Caesar's campaigns in the 1st century before the Common Era. At Alesia in 52 BCE, the Gallic leader Vercingetorix, who had briefly united tribes against Rome, surrendered. He was led in chains through Rome before execution. In the aftermath, Gallic cities acquired forums, aqueducts, and theaters. Resistance had been crushed, but the land was absorbed, taxed, and transformed into part of the imperial machine. In the east, Judea resisted fiercely. The Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 CE ended in devastation. Jerusalem was besieged, its temple burned, and survivors enslaved or dispersed. Yet Rome once again turned rebellion into opportunity. The province remained under Roman control, and the empire collected taxes even from the ruins it had created. Germania offered perhaps the harshest test. In 9 CE, 3 legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest, their standards captured by Germanic tribes. It was a humiliation unlike any other. But Rome did not abandon the frontier. It answered with decades of campaigning, creating fortified lines known as the limes, and eventually integrating many tribal groups into its orbit. Even where Rome bled, persistence restored its pride. The pattern was clear. Defiance led to punishment. Defeated lands were reshaped, their people absorbed, and their resources harvested. By the 2nd century, the empire had every reason to assume northern Britain would follow the same path. Yet it did not. Britain had been brought under imperial control only a few generations earlier. Claudius' invasion in 43 CE had established the first bridgeheads. By the time Agricola served as governor in the 80s, legions had marched deep into the north. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, wrote of victories against the Caledonii at Mons Graupius, where thousands of Britons were said to have fallen. But despite such claims, the territory remained unstable. Garrisons were stretched thin, and campaigns failed to produce lasting integration. When Hadrian inspected Britain in 122 CE, he made a decision no emperor before him had taken. Instead of pressing northward, he ordered construction of a massive wall across the narrowest point of northern England, from the River Tyne to the Solway Firth. This was more than a defensive measure. It was a declaration. Rome, which had prided itself on endless expansion, now institutionalized a limit. And so the questions arise. Why did Rome settle for defense in Britain when elsewhere it demanded conquest? Was it the environment, bogs, mists, and forests that resisted Roman engineering? Was it the people, tribes without kings or cities, who refused to fight on Rome's terms? Or was it economics, the realization that conquest of Caledonia offered little reward for the cost it demanded? The answers lie in evidence drawn from different directions. Ancient texts give us fragments: Tacitus' account of Agricola, Cassius Dio's history of the Severan campaigns, scattered inscriptions left by soldiers on the frontier. Archaeology adds more, the traces of abandoned forts like Inchtufel, pollen cores that suggest wetter, colder climates, and the remnants of roads broken by floods. Together they paint a picture of effort frustrated not once, but repeatedly. And yet, gaps remain. Rome's own accounts were propaganda. Victories were exaggerated, defeats minimized. Archaeology often reveals silence as much as certainty. Why was the fortress at Inchtufel abandoned before completion? Did shifts in climate make farming and transport even harder in the 2nd century? These are questions where scholars still debate. To understand why Rome drew a line at Hadrian's Wall, we must combine military history, environmental science, and economic calculation. Each strand tells part of the story, and together they reveal why Caledonia remained beyond reach. Hadrian's Wall was not just another feat of Roman engineering. It was a frontier of the mind. For the first time in centuries, Rome accepted that conquest was not inevitable. The legions that had crossed deserts and crushed kings now stood behind stone, declaring, "This far, and no further." But the wall was only the beginning of a longer, costlier debate inside Rome. What followed would force the empire, and us, to rethink what conquest truly meant. Rome was accustomed to landscapes yielding to its will. The empire built roads that cut across the Alps, aqueducts that carried water through valleys, and harbors dredged out of hostile coasts. Nature was bent, ordered, and pressed into service. But in Caledonia, nature itself became Rome's first and most enduring opponent. The geography of northern Britain was unlike anything the legions had encountered in Gaul, Hispania, or even Germania. The land rose in irregular ridges, split by narrow glens and sudden passes. Mountains loomed without symmetry, their slopes cloaked in forests that blocked light and sound. Valleys were filled with peat bogs that concealed their danger beneath deceptive surfaces. What looked like solid ground could collapse without warning, swallowing carts, pack animals, and sometimes men. Roman surveyors accustomed to charting lines and grids found themselves thwarted by terrain that defied measurement. Archaeological study of peat cores taken from the Scottish Highlands suggests that the climate during the Roman campaigns was colder and wetter than it is today. Pollen evidence indicates that forests were denser, with pine and birch stretching across large tracts of land. The implication is stark. Legions who had fought in dry Mediterranean theaters or in the open fields of Gaul now marched into an environment where visibility was limited, footing unstable, and progress painfully slow. The rivers of Caledonia compounded the problem. Fed by rainfall that seemed endless, they overflowed their banks, cutting paths through roads that had barely been laid. Timber bridges rotted within years, and stone foundations slipped on sodden ground. Roman engineers, famed for creating aqueducts that spanned valleys in Hispania and Judea, faced constant repair in Britain. Instead of monuments to permanence, their work became temporary barriers against water and decay. Weather intensified every weakness. Rain fell for days at a time, soaking leather straps, corroding iron, and weakening wooden structures. Legionaries' shields grew heavier with moisture, swords dulled quickly, and armor rusted along the seams. Fog descended without warning, blinding entire columns. Accounts from Tacitus note that Roman soldiers struggled not only against men but against the environment itself. Modern archaeologists confirm that damp conditions would have made disease, particularly dysentery and respiratory infections, rampant in camps. A telling example lies in the unfinished fortress at Inchtufel, situated on the River Tay. Planned as one of the largest legionary bases in northern Britain, it was designed to house up to 20,000 men. Yet the site was abandoned before completion. Excavations uncovered a massive cache of over 750,000 iron nails deliberately buried so that they could not be seized by hostile tribes. Why build a fortress of such scale only to desert it? Some scholars argue the decision was strategic, linked to shifting priorities elsewhere in the empire. Others emphasize the constant strain of supply and the vulnerability of such a large site in hostile terrain. Whatever the cause, the abandoned fortress stands as physical testimony to Rome's inability to anchor itself securely in Caledonia. Rhodes, the hallmark of Roman military control, fared no better. Archaeological surveys show that attempts to extend Rhodes northward frequently ended in collapse. Peat swallowed embankments, floods washed away foundations. Unlike in Gaul or Germania, where roads created corridors of control, in Scotland they became traps, long, narrow lines vulnerable to ambush and erasure. In places, traces of unfinished or redundant roads can still be found, scars of projects that drained manpower without producing reliable arteries of empire. What must be stressed is that these were not occasional inconveniences. They were systematic. Every mile of progress demanded disproportionate effort, every fort required endless maintenance, and every supply line risked being cut by a swollen river or a collapsed hillside. The empire's greatest strength, its ability to impose order on the physical world, was continually undone by mud, rain, and stone. The paleo-environmental record reinforces this conclusion. Studies of lake sediments indicate heightened rainfall and cooler temperatures in the 2nd century, conditions that would have shortened growing seasons and complicated local food production. Roman armies relied heavily on grain requisition, either by cultivating fields near forts or by seizing supplies from local populations. In Caledonia, both options faltered. Agricultural yields were unreliable, and any attempt to requisition food from hostile tribes provoked resistance. Thus, supplies had to be hauled from the south across difficult terrain, extending supply lines to breaking point. The logistical costs multiplied. A standard legion of around 5,000 men required tons of grain per week, not counting fodder for animals. With bogs undermining carts and rivers washing away crossings, even basic supply became precarious. Convoys could not move quickly, and when slowed, they became prime targets for ambush. Archaeological finds of scattered Roman military equipment far from known fortifications suggest that such attacks were frequent, though rarely recorded in official accounts. The empire had faced difficult terrain before, the Alps during Hannibal's invasion, the forests of Germania, the deserts of Syria. But in those theaters, Rome could eventually impose a system, clearing forests, draining marshes, or constructing aqueducts to tame deserts. In Caledonia, the effort to impose that system never stabilized. Nature reclaimed every advance. Forts flooded, roads vanished, and bridges collapsed. Each setback might appear minor in isolation, but together they created a grinding attrition. Rome's military machine was designed for decisive victories in set battles. In Caledonia, it faced a war of erosion. Not against armies, but against the land itself. The lesson is clear: geography and climate imposed costs that Roman planning could not easily absorb. Expansion was always judged by Rome not just in terms of victory, but in terms of sustainability. If an army could not maintain supply, if a fortress could not be held without ruinous expense, the conquest was not worth the map it was drawn upon. Caledonia fit that pattern exactly. Yet even as the legions struggled with bogs, rivers, and endless rain, another challenge grew sharper. Because if the land itself resisted occupation, the people who lived within it resisted even more fiercely. And unlike the terrain, these opponents could think, plan, and vanish into mist. Environmental forces did more than inconvenience Rome. They drained its treasury, exhausted its legions, and eroded its promise of permanence. Roads could be built, but they dissolved. Fortresses could rise, but they flooded. Supply lines could be laid, but they were devoured by mud. The land itself was Rome's first adversary, and it was an adversary that never tired. But as mud and rain gnawed at Rome's supply chains, another problem emerged: a people who did not present themselves for battle. Rome's second adversary in Caledonia was not stone or storm, but humanity itself. The tribes who inhabited the land resisted in ways unfamiliar to the imperial machine. Their names vary across the sources. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century, described the Caledonii and their allies as opponents of his father-in-law Agricola. In later accounts, new designations appear: the Meati, dwelling closer to the Antonine frontier, and eventually the Picti, literally, the painted ones, in Roman texts of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Whether these terms denoted distinct peoples or shifting identities is debated, but the Roman perspective was consistent. They faced not a kingdom but a shifting mosaic of communities that refused subjugation. What united these groups was not central authority. Archaeology reveals a pattern of small hill forts, enclosed farmsteads, and seasonal campsites rather than large urban centers. No cities, no monumental temples, and no centralized bureaucracies have been uncovered north of the frontier during the Roman period. These were kin-based societies, their cohesion maintained through family networks and localized loyalties. Authority appears to have been situational, resting on war leaders or councils rather than monarchs. For Rome, which thrived on co-opting elites, this presented an insoluble problem. There was no single figure to negotiate with, no capital to occupy, no temple whose destruction could break morale. The absence of urban centers also meant a different rhythm of life. Many communities were semi-mobile, exploiting seasonal resources, hunting in uplands, pasturing animals, and cultivating patches of land where the soil permitted. Such fluidity made them elusive targets. Roman armies, trained to besiege cities and dominate fixed strongholds, found themselves chasing communities that could disappear into glens at the first sign of danger. Roman accounts emphasize the warrior's appearance. They describe men marked with blue paint or tattoos, thought to be made from woad, though whether this dye was indeed used remains uncertain. To Roman eyes, these bodies seemed otherworldly, painted skin emerging from forests, shouting in languages alien to the legions. Cassius Dio noted that northern tribes fought naked, believing clothing slowed their movements. Modern scholars treat such descriptions cautiously. They may reflect Roman stereotyping of barbarian savagery rather than consistent practice. Yet archaeology does confirm distinct metalwork styles, weaponry, and decorated stones that suggest a strong symbolic identity. More decisive than appearance was method. These communities did not fight Rome in open fields. Instead, they turned the land to their advantage. Tacitus admitted that northern fighters avoided pitched battle, preferring sudden attacks and swift retreats. Modern interpretations describe this as a form of guerrilla warfare, ambushes in forests, raids on supply lines, feigned retreats to lure soldiers into difficult terrain. Roman formations, disciplined and effective on open plains, faltered when visibility was reduced and lines were broken by woodland or bog. The effect on morale was profound. Legionaries trained to confront visible enemies now faced foes they rarely saw. A patrol might march for hours through rain and fog, only to be hit by a volley of javelins from unseen ridges. By the time a counterattack was mounted, the attackers had vanished, leaving behind only empty hills and footprints dissolving in mud. The Romans called this bellum sylvestre, a forest war, a term that carried with it frustration and unease. For the Caledonian tribes, this method of fighting required superior intelligence. Scouts and informants must have tracked Roman movements constantly, predicting when supply lines were stretched or when patrols moved without reinforcement. That intelligence advantage likely stemmed from their own mobility and familiarity with the terrain. Every glen, ford, and ridge was a potential ambush site, every bog a hazard that could be turned into a trap. Rome's strength lay in its ability to make war predictable, fixed camps, steady advances, roads that secured supply. Caledonian warfare was the opposite. It was unpredictable, elusive, and based on dissolving back into the land. This style of resistance was not a sign of weakness but a deliberate adaptation. And it ensured that conquest, which for Rome usually meant one decisive clash and the capture of a capital, never materialized. The structural difference was decisive. Rome sought to impose order by seizing centers of power. In Caledonia, there were no centers to seize. The very decentralization of society was its defense. This was why conquest dragged on without resolution. Rome could fight battles, build forts, and even claim temporary victories, but nothing it seized translated into lasting control. When the Romans sought a decisive battle, they found only hills, footprints, and silence, and then a strike from the high ground. If you followed this far, tell us in the comments, which element of resistance surprises you more, the land itself, the social fabric, or the strategies of war. And if you want to see how Rome tried to answer these challenges with walls and campaigns, make sure you're subscribed to Tale of History. The Roman campaigns in northern Britain followed a pattern of ambition, brief advance, and costly withdrawal. Each generation seemed to test the frontier anew, only to find that Caledonia refused to be subdued. The earliest serious attempt came under the governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola in the 80s CE. Tacitus, his son-in-law, recorded victories that culminated at Mons Graupius, a battle he claimed cost the Caledonians 10,000 dead. Yet even Tacitus conceded that Rome's grip remained fragile. After Agricola's recall, many of his gains were abandoned. Archaeology supports this view. Forts built deep in the north were not permanently occupied. Rome could win set battles, but not secure the countryside. By the reign of Hadrian, the limits of control had become evident. In 122 CE the emperor personally ordered the construction of a continuous frontier barrier, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching over 118 kilometers from the Tyne to the Solway Firth, it was reinforced with mile castles, watchtowers, and garrisons. Unlike previous frontier systems, which were often porous and flexible, this wall signaled a deliberate decision: Rome would not extend its province further north. It was both military installation and imperial admission, acknowledging that the frontier must be fixed rather than advanced. Yet Rome's pride made such a stance temporary. Only 2 decades later, under Antoninus Pius, the empire sought once again to push north. Around 142 CE construction began on the Antonine Wall, a turf rampart stretching across the narrower waste of Scotland between the Forth and Clyde. At nearly 60 kilometers, it projected Roman power further into Caledonia, supported by forts and roads. But unlike Hadrian's stone wall, this turf frontier was vulnerable to erosion and constant repair. More crucially, the legions stationed there faced unrelenting raids. Supply lines lengthened, garrisons were stretched, and morale dwindled. Within less than 2 decades the Antonine frontier was abandoned. Rome retreated once more to Hadrian's Wall, conceding that the experiment in northern advance had failed. The cost of these fortifications was immense. Stone had to be quarried, timber cut, and troops diverted to construction rather than combat. Estimates based on surviving stretches suggest millions of tons of stone were moved for Hadrian's Wall alone. Maintaining garrisons in damp conditions multiplied expenses, while convoys carrying supplies were constant targets for raiders. Every fort required reinforcement, every road continuous repair. For a province expected to yield little in tribute or trade, these outlays became increasingly difficult to justify. One striking piece of evidence is the fortress at Inchtuthil, planned to anchor Roman presence in the Central Highlands. Excavation revealed it was abandoned before completion. In its soil lay a remarkable discovery: more than 750,000 iron nails, deliberately buried to prevent their capture. Why was such a massive base deserted? Scholars remain divided. Some argue it was strategic redeployment, others suggest supply strain and persistent hostility made the site untenable. Whatever the reason, the buried iron symbolized Rome's retreat, leaving behind not conquest but artifacts of frustration. The tactical mismatch compounded these difficulties. Roman legions excelled in set-piece battles, deploying heavy infantry in ordered lines, supported by cavalry and siege engines. In the forests and bogs of Caledonia, this system broke down. Ambushes struck isolated columns. Thick woodland prevented the deployment of large formations. Roads under construction became targets, trapping soldiers between unfinished works and sudden attacks. Rome could clear forests or drain marshes over time, but in Caledonia such projects collapsed under constant pressure. Heavy armor that signified Roman discipline became a liability when footing was unstable and maneuver limited. Thus, the Antonine Wall stands as the clearest symbol of the contradiction. Rome pushed forward in confidence, only to abandon the advance within a generation. Forts could be built, but they could not be sustained economically or politically. Rome could defeat tribes in open encounters, but could not translate those victories into control. Each campaign ended in withdrawal, each wall in concession. If walls failed to solve the problem, Rome's answer grew more brutal, and more expensive. Every Roman conquest carried a calculation. Roads, garrisons, and campaigns demanded vast resources, but the expectation was that new provinces would eventually repay the cost. Gaul yielded grain, wine, and manpower. Egypt became the empire's granary, its harvests feeding Rome itself. Hispania offered silver, tin, and olive oil. Even difficult provinces like Judea produced taxes and controlled trade routes. War was not simply about glory. It was an investment. Caledonia broke this pattern. Its population was sparse. Archaeological traces suggest only small pockets of arable land, scattered hill forts, and farmsteads without the scale of intensive agriculture that Rome relied on for requisition. Mineral deposits of iron and lead existed, but the terrain made large-scale exploitation impossible. Convoys bringing tools or ore out of the highlands would have been perpetual targets, with more soldiers required to guard them than the minerals were worth. This imbalance placed a heavy burden on logistics. A single legion of 5,000 men required more than 80,000 kilograms of grain per month, plus fodder for animals. In fertile regions, armies could forage or requisition supplies from local populations. In Caledonia, both options were unreliable. Rain shortened growing seasons, and hostile tribes made requisition hazardous. Supplies had to be transported from southern Britain or shipped along coasts, creating lines vulnerable to ambush and storm. What should have been the empire's greatest strength, the ability to sustain legions far from home, became a liability as costs mounted without return. The greatest test of this imbalance came during the reign of Septimius Severus. In 208 CE the emperor himself traveled to Britain, bringing with him a massive force estimated at over 50,000 soldiers. Few emperors ever led campaigns in person. Severus, already ill and aging, believed only direct imperial presence could resolve the humiliation of the unconquered north. His strategy was not assimilation but annihilation. Cassius Dio records that Severus ordered scorched earth measures, villages burned, forests cut, crops destroyed. The aim was to break resistance by removing the means of survival. But Caledonia absorbed this violence and gave little in return. The further the legions marched, the harsher the conditions became. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Carts broke axles. Horses and pack animals collapsed. Soldiers labored under sodden armor, while constant damp bred fevers and infections. The very environment that had undermined earlier campaigns now gnawed at Rome's largest British army. Dio writes that more than 50,000 men perished, not from pitched battles but from disease and the weariness of marching. Whether that figure is exaggerated remains uncertain, but the testimony conveys the scale of attrition. Morale suffered. Soldiers trained to expect decisive victories saw only empty glens and fleeting raids. For every fort seized, another outpost was abandoned. For every patrol advanced, another column faltered in the bogs. The psychological toll was severe. Exhaustion, isolation, and the knowledge that triumph would not yield plunder or fertile provinces, only barren ground and endless resistance. The campaign ended not in victory but in imperial death. In 211 CE, Severus succumbed to illness in Eboracum, modern York. His son Caracalla briefly considered continuing the campaign, but soon negotiated peace with the tribes and withdrew. The emperor who had promised to crush Caledonia left nothing but abandoned forts and exhausted legions. Rome had poured men, treasure, and imperial prestige into the north, and gained nothing. The Severan campaign crystallized the larger truth. Conquest had to feed the empire. Caledonia consumed it instead. Every mile advanced drained the treasury, every soldier lost strained manpower reserves. Provinces that once financed Rome now carried its debts. For administrators in the capital, the question was no longer how to conquer Scotland, but why to attempt it at all. Even an emperor's presence could not guarantee victory, and his death underscored a deeper imperial dilemma. Rome's campaigns in Caledonia reveal the harsh arithmetic of empire. When the cost outweighed the return, even the most ambitious emperors faltered. If you want full references and further reading, check the notes linked below. And if you value history told with evidence and clarity, subscribe to Tale of History so you never miss the next chapter. Rome's encounter with Caledonia was more than a military frustration. It reshaped imperial policy. For centuries, expansion had been the rhythm of Rome, each new province paying for the next conquest, each victory reinforcing the idea of boundless dominion. In northern Britain, that rhythm broke. The decision to construct Hadrian's Wall, and later to retreat behind it after the failure of the Antonine frontier, signaled a turning point. The empire no longer sought universal conquest. It chose instead to defend, to consolidate, and to accept boundaries. This shift echoed beyond Britain. Across the Rhine and the Danube, Rome increasingly invested in walls, forts, and defensive lines, the limes, rather than in bold new offensives. Expansion did not cease altogether, but the age of great annexations was over. Caledonia was not the sole cause of this change, but it was among the most visible frontiers where Rome admitted the limits of its power. The consequences endured. Hadrian's Wall became not only a military barrier but also a cultural and psychological one. To the south lay the Romanized world, dotted with villas, towns, and markets. To the north stretched a different order, hills, tribes, and societies that refused integration. The wall was thus more than stone. It was an acknowledgement that Rome could not make every landscape Roman. Archaeology preserves this story in mute testimony. The abandoned fortress of Untold, with its buried hoard of iron nails, speaks to projects halted before their time. The Antonine Wall, eroded and overgrown, remains a faint trace of a failed experiment in expansion. Pollen cores confirm the wetter, harsher climate that worsened Rome's struggle. These fragments of evidence, when placed together, tell us that failure was not sudden but cumulative, the result of environment, society, economics, and strategy interacting. Later memory added its own layers. Medieval chroniclers spoke of northern peoples who resisted Rome's power, crafting legends of defiance that blurred history with myth. Place names and Pictish stones stand as cultural continuities, reminders that Rome never left an enduring administrative imprint. Unlike Gaul or Hispania, where Roman law and language remained long after the empire's collapse, Scotland bore no such legacy. Its identity remained its own. When we analyze the causes, no single factor is sufficient. The environment was hostile, bogs, rivers, and constant rain eroded infrastructure and drained morale. The society was decentralized. Without cities or monarchs, there was nothing Rome could seize to impose order. The economics were unbalanced. The costs of conquest and supply outweighed any conceivable returns. And the strategy was mismatched. Heavy legions designed for open battle were ill-suited to ambush and guerrilla war. Each factor was significant, but together they formed an insurmountable barrier. Historians disagree on their ranking. Some emphasize the environment as decisive. Others stress the absence of economic reward, arguing that if Caledonia had been rich in grain or gold, Rome would have persisted despite the climate. Still others highlight political will, that emperors judged the prize too small to justify perpetual war. The truth may lie in the convergence of all these explanations. Caledonia endured unconquered because every path Rome tried, battle, fortification, or annihilation, was undermined by another force. The lesson is larger than the frontier itself. Rome's experience demonstrates that no empire, however disciplined, is infinite. Geography, culture, and cost can impose limits more effectively than armies. To build a wall is to acknowledge those limits, and in that acknowledgement we glimpse the humanity of even the most formidable power. Caledonia did not topple Rome. The empire would endure for centuries more. But the northern frontier became a scar on imperial pride, a reminder that conquest is never absolute. The stones of Hadrian's Wall still stretch across England, the faint ridges of the Antonine Wall still cut through Scottish soil, and the echoes of Severus' wasted campaign still linger in the historical record. They remind us of the line Rome could not cross. Rome's empire could extend far, but Caledonia declared, in peat and stone, that not every place could be owned. If you have followed this journey, you have seen how land, people, and empire collided in one of Rome's greatest frustrations. Subscribe to Tale of History for more evidence-based explorations. Join the discussion in the comments.